The historical period known as the Banana Wars, 1898-1934, represents a crucial and formative chapter in the assertion of American power on the world stage. It was an era defined not by a single declared conflict, but by a protracted series of military and political interventions conducted by the United States across the nations of Central America and the Caribbean. The overarching mission during these 36 years was unambiguous: to protect and advance American economic interests, which were, above all, tied to the immense profits of powerful American fruit companies. Throughout this epoch of expansionist policy, which touched more than 10 countries in the region, the United States Marine Corps served as the primary tool of enforcement. Marines were dispatched to occupy ports, quell rebellions, and prop up friendly regimes, acting as the armed guarantors for American corporate investments and ensuring that the political climate of these sovereign nations remained favorable to U.S. commercial endeavors. The consequences of this prolonged intervention were profound and lasting, fundamentally reshaping the political and economic landscape of the entire region. The most significant outcome was the creation and cementing of what came to be known as banana republics. This pejorative term accurately described the resulting political entities, states that were nominally independent but whose economies were almost entirely dependent on the cultivation and export of a single agricultural commodity. This economic structure was not a natural development, but a carefully managed system controlled by foreign corporations. These companies owned not only the land, but also the critical infrastructure, railways, ports, and communication lines, giving them near total control over the nations in which they operated. The governments of these republics were often weak, corrupt, and beholden to the interests of their corporate patrons, with American military power always lingering as the ultimate arbiter of political disputes. The main actors driving the events of the Banana Wars were a powerful alliance of business and military force. On one side were the titans of American agribusiness, the United Fruit Company, the Standard Fruit Company, and the Cuyamo Fruit Company. These corporations were the architects of the economic order in the region, wielding their vast wealth to influence politicians, secure massive land concessions, and operate with impunity. They functioned as states within states, their corporate decisions carrying more weight than national laws. On the other side was the United States Marine Corps, the disciplined and effective military force that translated corporate desires into geopolitical reality. Whether it was landing in a port to restore order during a labor strike or occupying a capital city to oversee a political transition, the Marines provided the muscle that made this system of economic exploitation possible. This era thus established a precedent for a foreign policy in which the distinction between national interest and private corporate profit became inextricably blurred, leaving a complex and often painful legacy that continues to influence the dynamics of the Western Hemisphere. The era of American interventionism that would become known as the Banana Wars did not begin in a vacuum. Its origins can be traced to a single, transformative event that irrevocably altered the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere, the Spanish-American War of 1898. This brief but decisive conflict served as the primary catalyst, the political and military justification that threw open the gates for an unprecedented wave of American expansion into the Caribbean. The collapse of the centuries-old Spanish Empire in the region created a power vacuum that the United States, a rising industrial and military power, was more than willing to fill. The war acted as a trigger, providing the U.S. with both the opportunity and the pretext to establish a permanent foothold in strategically vital territories. It was here, in the immediate aftermath of Spain's defeat, that American corporations and the military began to methodically entrench themselves, laying the groundwork for decades of political and economic dominance that would redefine the future of Central America and the Caribbean. The most direct and tangible outcome of the war was the transfer of colonial possessions. In 1898, the United States gained direct control over Cuba and Puerto Rico, effectively seizing the heart of the Caribbean from its former European master. This was not merely a territorial acquisition, it was a profound strategic victory. By establishing a formidable military presence on these islands, the United States projected its power into the very center of the region, creating forward bases from which it could influence events across the surrounding mainland and sea lanes. The arrival of American troops and administrators marked the end of one colonial era and the definitive beginning of another, albeit one that would operate under a different and more nuanced guise. The formal structures of empire were replaced by a system of informal control, backed by the ever-present threat of military force. Following the war, the United States swiftly moved to formalize its newfound influence under the carefully crafted policy of a protectorate. Publicly, this policy was framed as a noble and benevolent mission. America was stepping in to shield the weak democracies of the region from the predatory ambitions of European powers. It was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, presented as a selfless act of Pan-American solidarity. However, this official narrative served as a convenient veneer for the true underlying objective. The primary driver of American policy was not the protection of democratic ideals, but the safeguarding of rapidly growing corporate investments. American companies had poured significant capital into the region's agriculture, mining, and infrastructure, and the U.S. government now viewed the political stability of these nations, or the lack thereof, through the lens of its economic interests. The protection offered was in reality the protection of American profits. This dynamic was perhaps most evident in the case of Cuba. According to a persistent rumor that circulated in diplomatic and political circles at the time, the initial American plan following the occupation was the outright annexation of the island, incorporating it directly into the United States. However, facing significant international pressure and a growing anti-imperialist sentiment at home, the American leadership was compelled to adopt a more subtle approach. Instead of direct colonization, the U.S. government agreed to grant Cuba a purely formal independence. This independence was heavily circumscribed, with the United States retaining the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, control its foreign policy, and maintain a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. This model of nominal sovereignty under de facto American control would become a blueprint for future interventions throughout the region. The atmosphere of this new order was vividly captured on the streets of post-war Havana. By 1899, the visual landscape of the ancient Spanish colony had been transformed. American flags now fluttered from buildings where the Spanish standard had flown for centuries, a stark symbol of the new hierarchy. The windows of local shops, once filled with goods from Madrid and Barcelona, were now brimming with products shipped directly from New York, heralding the arrival of American commercial supremacy. Officers of the U.S. Marine Corps, conspicuous in their bright, immaculate uniforms, marched confidently down the cobbled lanes, exchanging salutes with local officials, who, only a year prior, had been serving the Spanish crown. A new and complex sensory blend filled the air. The familiar aromas of Cuban tobacco and the bustling harbor now mingled with the distinct smell of foreign oil and industry. This cultural and political shift was further embodied by the sight of an American missionary conducting an English lesson for a group of Cuban children, earnestly extolling the virtues and benefits of the American way of life. It was a microcosm of the era itself, a complex interplay of military force, economic penetration, and a self-proclaimed civilizing mission that together defined the dawn of the Banana Wars.
As the United States solidified its influence in the Caribbean, its ambitions turned toward a project of monumental global significance, the construction of a transoceanic canal through the narrow isthmus of Panama. This section reveals the story of how the United States leveraged a combination of military intimidation and shrewd political manipulation to sever Panama from Colombia and seize control over the canal's construction and subsequent operation. The Panama Canal was not merely an engineering marvel. It was the single most important strategic and economic achievement of American expansionism in the era. Its completion would allow the United States to control the arteries of international trade, project its naval power across 2 oceans, and cement its status as the undisputed hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. The methods used to achieve this triumph would become a textbook example of the new American foreign policy in action. The path to this triumph was paved with diplomatic conflict and clandestine maneuvering. In the early 1900s, the territory of Panama was a province of Colombia, and the Colombian government was hesitant to grant the United States the sweeping concessions it demanded for the Canal Zone. Frustrated by these negotiations, the U.S. pivoted from diplomacy to subversion. The pivotal moment came in 1903 with the outbreak of the Panamanian Rebellion. The United States actively and decisively supported the separatist movement, dispatching warships to the Panamanian coast. This naval presence served a clear purpose: to prevent Colombian forces from landing and crushing the uprising. With its own military effectively neutralized by the American blockade, the Colombian government could do nothing as its province broke away. On November 3, 1903, Panama declared independence. In a move that left no doubt as to its involvement, the United States officially recognized the new nation just 3 days later, becoming the first country in the world to do so. Behind this public display of gunboat diplomacy, rumors swirled of a more covert, black operation. Whispers in political and intelligence circles suggested that a predecessor to the CIA, U.S. military intelligence, had directly coordinated the uprising. According to these accounts, American agents had worked through intermediaries to provide financial compensation to the Panamanian libertarians, effectively purchasing a revolution that would serve American interests. Though difficult to prove definitively, these rumors highlight the pervasive belief that the rebellion was not an organic movement, but a carefully orchestrated event, managed and funded from Washington. With Panama's independence secured, the United States moved quickly to capitalize on its investment. The new Panamanian government, indebted to its powerful patron, signed a treaty granting the U.S. control over a 10-mile-wide canal zone in perpetuity. The canal was officially opened in 1914, a momentous occasion that reshaped global maritime routes. While the United States formally recognized Panama's sovereignty over the canal itself, the reality of the arrangement was far different. The agreement stipulated that the U.S. would retain military control over the zone for 99 years, guaranteeing that American commercial and naval vessels would always have unimpeded passage. This strategic advantage was further exploited by American corporations, most notably the United Fruit Company, which began operations in Panama shortly after independence. The company was granted vast land concessions along the canal and the coast, quickly establishing itself as one of the largest and most powerful landowners in the newly formed republic. The unapologetic nature of this intervention was famously, if perhaps apocryphally, captured in a quote attributed to President Theodore Roosevelt. When asked how the United States had secured the deal to build the canal, he allegedly boasted, "I took Panama." While historians debate the precise wording and context of this statement, it perfectly encapsulates the spirit of muscular interventionism that defined his presidency and the era. The reality on the ground was starkly illustrated by an anecdote popular among the canal builders. The engineers were said to have joked, "We are building the canal for the U.S., and Panama manages it on paper." This dark humor pointed to an undeniable truth. While a Panamanian flag might fly over government buildings, it was the U.S. Marines who guarded every lock and dam of the canal. In practice, the American military base commander often wielded more tangible influence over the affairs of the nation than the Panamanian president himself, cementing the canal not only as an economic asset, but as a symbol of American imperial might.
If one country were to serve as the classic defining example of a banana republic, it would be Honduras. It was here that the model of corporate political collusion reached its zenith, with American fruit companies intervening directly and brazenly in the nation's politics. They financed coups, installed presidents, and treated the country as a private fiefdom, using the United States Marines as their personal instrument of coercion and suppression. This section details the series of interventions and corporate-sponsored political upheavals that transformed Honduras into a virtual colony of the fruit companies, establishing an economic and political system where national sovereignty was entirely subordinate to foreign commercial interests. The pattern of intervention began early. In 1903, the United States dispatched Marines to Honduras for the first time, citing the standard justification of protecting American citizens and restoring order amidst local political turmoil. This set a crucial precedent, signaling that the U.S. military was prepared to act as the ultimate guarantor of stability, a stability defined by the needs of American businesses. This environment of implicit military backing emboldened corporate figures to take matters into their own hands. Chief among them was Samuel Zemurray, the audacious founder of the Cuyamo Fruit Company. In 1908, Zemurray orchestrated his first major political gambit, an attempted coup against President Miguel Dávila. Though this initial effort failed, it was a clear demonstration of his willingness to use extra-legal means to achieve his business objectives. Undeterred, he refined his approach. Between 1910 and 1911, he sponsored a second, successful coup. He provided weapons and financing to the exiled former president, Manuel Bonilla, who launched an invasion to reclaim power. The effort succeeded. President Dávila was forced to flee the country, and Bonilla was installed as the new head of state. Zemurray's reward was immediate and immense. The new, grateful government granted him a colossal concession of 5,000 acres of prime agricultural land, along with a staggering 99-year exemption from all taxes. This single transaction encapsulated the mechanics of the Banana Republic. Corporate capital had directly purchased political power, which in turn yielded enormous state-sanctioned profits. With the door to Honduras kicked wide open, U.S. interventions became routine. American Marines were sent back into the country repeatedly in 1912, 1919, 1924, and 1925. On each occasion, their mission was to crush popular uprisings, put down labor strikes, and protect the interests of the powerful United Fruit Company, which was rapidly expanding its own empire alongside Cuyamo. The Honduran state was rendered powerless, its authority superseded by the decisions made in the boardrooms of Boston and New Orleans. This corporate dominance reached its apex in 1929 when the colossal United Fruit Company bought out Zemurray's Cuyamo Fruit Company, absorbing its rival's vast holdings. In a final ironic twist, Samuel Zemurray himself would later become the CEO of the consolidated United Fruit in 1933, completing his journey from rogue operator to the kingpin of the entire banana empire. It was in this very environment that the term Banana Republic was born. The writer O. Henry, who had spent time in Honduras working at gold mines, coined the phrase to describe countries where foreign corporations held complete sway over the political and economic life of the nation, a reality he had witnessed firsthand. The endemic corruption that defined this system was starkly noted in official documents. A report from the American Diplomatic Corps stated, United Fruit Company received 162,000 hectares of land in 1913 alone, often for money that immediately ended up in the pockets of local politicians. A vivid picture of this reality can be imagined in the capital, Tegucigalpa, in 1911. The presidential palace is occupied by mercenaries armed with new American rifles.
a freshly hung portrait of Manuel Bonilla, the president just returned to power by corporate financing, adorns a wall. Inside an office, an executive from the Cuyamu Fruit Company sits at a desk casually signing concession documents alongside the newly appointed finance minister. They share a laugh. "The president will change the law within a week," one remarks. "It's just business." Observing the scene with quiet approval is the American consul, secure in the knowledge that his country's military stands ready to guarantee the sanctity of this arrangement, ensuring that American investments would remain undisturbed.
While interventions in other nations were often brief surgical affairs, Nicaragua became the site of a prolonged and deeply entrenched military presence, transforming the country into a veritable symbol of American imperialism. For decades, it served as an arena for a series of U.S. interventions, proxy civil wars, and the systematic suppression of local resistance. The occupation of Nicaragua was so extensive that the United States Marine Corps transitioned from a temporary peacekeeping force into a de facto colonial government, effectively managing the nation's internal affairs. This period demonstrates the evolution of American intervention from short-term actions to a sustained campaign of political control, where the lines between protecting interests and outright rule became irrevocably blurred. The initial phase of deep engagement began between 1907 and 1909, when a civil war erupted between the country's conservative and liberal factions. Seeing an opportunity to install a more compliant government, the United States dispatched troops to support the conservative regime against the liberal insurgency. The American objective, however, extended far beyond simply picking a winner in a local conflict. The intervention culminated in a move of profound strategic importance. The United States seized control over the National Bank of Nicaragua. This action placed the nation's finances and, by extension, its economic sovereignty directly in American hands, ensuring that any future government would be financially dependent and answerable to Washington. The military aspect of the occupation was punctuated by moments of intense, one-sided violence. One of the most famous skirmishes of the Banana Wars occurred on September 19, 1912, the Battle of Masaya. A detachment of 400 Marines, under the command of Major Smedley Butler, was traveling by rail to the city of Masaya when their train was ambushed by rebel forces. In a display of either extreme courage or brazen contempt for the enemy, Butler reportedly sat on an open platform car at the very front of the train throughout the journey, casually dangling his legs. The ensuing battle was a massacre. According to official reports, between 56 and 68 Nicaraguan fighters were killed in the engagement. In stark contrast, the Americans suffered only 5 wounded. The lopsided casualty count was a brutal testament to the superior firepower and discipline of the Marine Corps. This period was also marked by persistent rumors of extreme cruelty, which painted a grim picture of the tactics employed by the occupying forces. One particularly shocking story, widely circulated at the time, concerned the taking of Fort Riviere. According to these accounts, a contingent of Marines allegedly used machine guns to slaughter 50 Haitian rebels in the span of just 10 minutes. What made the rumored incident so horrific was the claim that the defenders of the fort were armed with little more than wooden clubs and stones, rendering the encounter less a battle and more a systematic execution. From 1917 to 1933, the American presence evolved into a state of permanent occupation. The U.S. maintained a garrison of nearly 2,000 Marines in Nicaragua, ostensibly for the purpose of maintaining order. In reality, their role was far more expansive. The Marines became the ultimate political arbiters in the country, directly controlling the electoral process and overseeing the appointments of key government officials. This long-term intervention came at a staggering human cost, with estimates suggesting that over 1,000 Nicaraguans were killed as a direct result of the American military presence. The mindset of the occupiers was chillingly captured in a letter written by a Marine officer to his family in 1912, in which he stated, quote, "We are ready to shoot anyone and anything that violates the peace. If necessary, "We will shoot up entire towns." End quote. At the heart of many of these campaigns was Smedley Butler, who emerged as one of the most decorated and celebrated military leaders of the Banana Wars. His reputation for battlefield prowess was solidified by his being awarded the Medal of Honor on 2 separate occasions, a rare achievement shared by only one other Marine in history, for his actions in China, 1900, and Haiti, 1915. However, in a twist that would add a complex epilogue to his career, Butler would later retire and become one of the most vocal and powerful critics of the very American imperialism he had once so effectively enforced.
While previous American interventions in the region were often characterized by their focus on economic control and political manipulation, the occupations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic descended into a far darker and more oppressive chapter of the Banana Wars. These nations witnessed the most prolonged and overtly brutal applications of American military power. Here, the United States abandoned even the thinnest pretense of protecting fragile democracies, instead imposing direct military dictatorships fueled by deep-seated racial prejudices. The occupations were quasi-colonial in nature, defined by mass repression, strict censorship, and a level of violence that left an indelible scar on both societies. The long and bloody occupation of Haiti began in 1915, not as the result of a carefully considered policy decision from Washington, but through the audacious and unauthorized action of a military commander on the ground. Admiral William Paperton, in command of a U.S. cruiser squadron, landed 5 companies of Marines in the port of Port-au-Prince without receiving any direct orders from his superiors. The local resistance was minimal and quickly overwhelmed, allowing the United States to seize control of the capital with ease. This swift takeover marked the beginning of a harsh and unforgiving military rule that would last for 19 years, fundamentally altering the course of Haitian history. The brutality of the occupation was laid bare in November 1915 during the infamous meat grinder at Fort Riviere. In a chilling display of technological superiority and ruthless force, a contingent of U.S. Marines armed with machine guns assaulted the fort, which was defended by a group of Haitian rebels. The defenders, armed with a motley collection of old rifles, clubs, and stones, stood no chance. The Marines opened fire, and in the span of just 10 minutes, 50 Haitians were cut down. This massacre became a grim symbol of the occupation's character, where organized resistance was met with overwhelming and indiscriminate violence. The conflict was further defined by persistent and disturbing rumors of torture and extrajudicial killings. In letters sent home, American soldiers wrote of employing brutal interrogation methods, carrying out summary executions, and firing on civilians who were merely suspected of having ties to the resistance, painting a picture of an occupying force operating with near total impunity. A year later, in 1916, the United States extended its military control over the entire island of Hispaniola by occupying the Dominican Republic. This occupation was in some ways even more direct than the one in Haiti. The U.S. military administration dispensed entirely with the formality of maintaining a native president, establishing an undisguised military government. American officers assumed all executive and legislative functions, appointing local officials and issuing laws by decree under a state of martial law. This direct colonial-style rule lasted for 8 years, during which the Dominican Republic ceased to be a sovereign nation in anything but name. The ideologies underpinning these brutal occupations were explicitly racist. An official report from an American military commissioner in Haiti during the 1920s chillingly summarized this worldview. Haitians are a people of a low race. They are incapable of self-government. Therefore, we must govern them as military administrators, issuing orders and punishing violators. This is a burden we bear in the name of civilization. This dehumanizing attitude provided the moral justification for the occupiers' extreme measures and was reflected in the cultural misunderstandings that plagued the occupation. A bizarre anecdote from the time illustrates this disconnect. American Marines in Haiti reportedly engaged in hunts for local spirits and ghosts, which the Haitians called zombies. Marine officers even filed official reports detailing their encounters with the undead, completely failing to understand that they were not fighting supernatural forces, but a clandestine anti-colonial resistance movement that used the mysticism of voodoo as a shield to protect its activities from military persecution. The era of direct military rule finally drew to a close in 1934. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's new Good Neighbor policy, the United States officially ended its 19-year occupation of Haiti and withdrew its troops. However, this departure was far from a clean break. While the Marines may have left, a deep and lasting American political influence remained, ensuring that the legacy of this brutal period would continue to shape the nation's future for decades to come.
No analysis of the Banana Wars would be complete without a dedicated focus on the corporate entities that were the primary drivers of the conflict. This section delves into the immense power of the United Fruit Company and its competitors, which evolved from mere businesses into quasi-governmental powers that effectively ruled the region. Their influence was so pervasive and their reach so extensive that they earned a fitting and fearsome nickname, El Pulpo, or the Octopus. This moniker perfectly captured the reality of their operations, with corporate tentacles extending deep into every sphere of political, economic, and social life. The fruit companies were not just participants in the region's economy, they were its architects and its masters, using the United States Marine Corps as a private enforcement arm to protect their assets and assert their will. The foundation of this corporate empire was laid with astonishing speed. Between 1899 and 1905, the United Fruit Company engaged in a relentless campaign of expansion, establishing a dominant presence in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. Its primary strategy was to offer a trade that the weak and cash-strapped governments of the region could not refuse. In exchange for the construction of critical infrastructure like railways and ports, the company received enormous land concessions. These agreements were heavily skewed in the company's favor, granting it control over vast tracts of the most fertile land, often for generations to come. This model allowed United Fruit to build and own the very logistical networks upon which the entire export economy depended, giving it a stranglehold over the nations in which it operated. By 1930, the company had reached the apex of its power, achieving a near total monopoly. United Fruit controlled a staggering 90% of all banana imports into the United States, making it the undisputed king of the industry. It had also become the single largest employer in all of Central America, a position that gave it immense leverage over the labor force and national economies. Its physical footprint was equally immense, with the company owning over 600,000 acres of land across the region. But the Octopus moniker was earned not just for its size, but for the depth of its control. The company did not merely grow bananas, its tentacles were wrapped around the entire infrastructure of the state. It owned the railways, the port facilities, the telegraph and telephone lines, and even exerted influence over the national banks and political systems. This dominance was maintained through a combination of corruption and brute force. It was widely rumored that the company regularly bribed local politicians to ensure the passage of laws that were favorable to its interests. Some sources even allege that the company offered direct, personal payments to presidents in exchange for key political decisions, effectively placing the leaders of sovereign nations on its payroll. When bribery and manipulation were not enough, the company relied on repression. This was brutally demonstrated during the Great Banana Strike of 1934 in Costa Rica. In a massive and unprecedented show of solidarity, more than 100,000 workers from over 30 different unions walked off the job, demanding better working conditions and fair wages. United Fruit's response was unequivocal. It flatly refused to negotiate. The strike was subsequently met with violent and merciless repression, sending a clear message to the entire region that any challenge to the company's authority would be crushed. A powerful, though not fully verified quote attributed to a United Fruit Company executive perfectly summarizes the corporate mindset of the era. "We don't just sell bananas.
We shape laws, appoint presidents, control currency, and determine the fate of these nations. The U.S. Marine Corps simply carries out our will. This sentiment is vividly illustrated by imagining a scene in a company office in Honduras around 1920. A massive map of the region hangs on the wall, covered in red and blue marks indicating the company's vast land holdings and the territories of its rivals. An American businessman sits at an expensive desk next to the local president, a man he recently helped install in power. A chart on the table shows the soaring graph of the banana trade. The U.S. consul enters with news. A workers' rebellion has been suppressed, and the Marines have secured their positions. The three men smile. The company is ready for the next harvest.
This section is dedicated to one of the most tragic and brutal episodes of the entire Banana Wars era, the Banana Massacre in Santa Marta, Colombia. More than just a violent confrontation, this event became a horrifying symbol of the lengths to which corporations and their allied governments would go to crush any attempt by workers to demand justice and basic human dignity. The massacre stands as a stark testament to the cold calculus of corporate power, where profit was held to be infinitely more valuable than human life. The prelude to the tragedy began on November 12, 1928, when approximately 10,000 workers employed by the United Fruit Company ceased work and went on strike. Their demands were not revolutionary. They were asking for fundamental rights and decent labor conditions. The strikers called for a 6-day work week instead of the grueling 7-day schedule, payment in actual currency rather than company scrip, which could only be spent at overpriced company-owned stores, and improvements to their squalid living quarters. United Fruit's response was immediate and absolute. It refused to negotiate. The company denied the legitimacy of the strike itself, framing the organized workers not as employees with grievances, but as a mob of dangerous rioters. After weeks of a tense standoff, with the company remaining intransigent, the Colombian government of President Miguel Abadía Méndez made a fateful decision. On December 5th and 6th, 1928, a regiment of 700 soldiers under the command of General Cortés Vargas was dispatched to the region. The troops moved into the central square of the small town of Ciénaga, a gathering point for the striking workers and their families. They took up strategic positions, setting up machine gun nests on the rooftops of the surrounding buildings and methodically blocking all the exit routes. An officer then issued a chilling ultimatum to the crowd. They had 5 minutes to disperse. The scene, as reconstructed from historical accounts, was one of fateful disbelief. It was a Sunday, and about 1,500 workers, accompanied by their wives and children, had gathered in the square after church services, awaiting a promised address from the provincial governor. The sun beat down on the tense crowd. When the soldiers appeared on the rooftops and the 5-minute warning was shouted, the people did not move. Many believed it was a bluff, that their own government would never dare to open fire on unarmed citizens. As the final seconds ticked away in absolute silence, that belief was shattered. An order was given, and the deafening roar of automatic weapons filled the air. The soldiers fired indiscriminately into the crowd. People fell in heaps as bullets ripped through men, women, and children alike. Blood flowed across the stone plaza. In 20 minutes of intense, sustained gunfire, the square was transformed into a killing field. Trucks and trains were brought in to haul the bodies away, many of which were reportedly dumped into the sea to conceal the true scale of the slaughter. The next day, newspapers printed the cold official line, "Order has been restored." The exact number of victims remains a subject of intense dispute and is itself a part of the cover-up. General Cortés Vargas officially admitted to only 47 deaths. However, eyewitnesses and subsequent diplomatic reports told a vastly different story. The Colombian Congressman Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, investigating the massacre, claimed that the bodies were deliberately hidden to obscure the truth. The historian Herrera Soto later compiled various estimates that ranged from the official 47 to as many as 2,000 killed.
Today, the most widely accepted scholarly estimates place the death toll between 1,000 and 2,000 people. Telegrams from the American ambassador in Bogota, sent at the time, confirmed that U.S. officials were not only aware of the violence, but saw it as a solution. One dispatch read, "Bogota and Santa Marta report that the situation is very serious. The area is in revolt. The military, having orders not to spare ammunition, has already killed and wounded about 50 strikers." An even more damning telegram, dated December 7, 1928, revealed the company's own assessment. Judging from the reports from Bogota, the representative of the United Fruit Company has reported that the total number of strikers killed by the Colombian military machine exceeded 1,000. Furthermore, persistent rumors suggested that a contingent of U.S. troops was waiting nearby, ready to intervene if the Colombian army proved incapable of crushing the strike, a tactic typical of the Banana Wars. In the aftermath, United Fruit never accepted any responsibility for the massacre. The company soon abandoned its operations in Colombia, leaving behind a legacy of mass graves and economic ruin. The event gave rise to a bitter saying that spread through revolutionary circles across Latin America: "Before profit, there is always blood, and then silence."
The final major intervention of this era took place in Guatemala, serving as a grim epilogue to the Banana Wars and a chilling prologue to the Cold War. While the direct use of U.S. Marines had fallen out of fashion, the underlying motives remained unchanged. The Guatemalan episode demonstrated a crucial evolution in American tactics, shifting from overt military occupation to covert, CIA-orchestrated coups. The nation became a battleground, where the forces of a democratically elected government, determined to enact social reforms, collided head-on with the immense power of the United Fruit Company, which now wielded the specter of communism as its most potent weapon. The stage was set by the Guatemalan Revolution of 1944, a popular uprising that successfully overthrew a long-standing military dictatorship and ushered in an unprecedented decade of democracy and social progress. This new era of reform reached its zenith in 1951 with the inauguration of President Jacobo Arbenz. Committed to transforming Guatemala into a modern, equitable nation, Arbenz initiated his signature policy, a sweeping agrarian reform program codified in Decree 900. The law's objective was to expropriate and redistribute large tracts of uncultivated land to impoverished, landless peasants. This policy was not aimed at all landowners, but specifically targeted the vast fallow estates held by the nation's largest proprietor, the United Fruit Company. At the time, the company controlled an astonishing 40% of all land in Guatemala, much of which it deliberately kept out of production for speculative purposes, to stifle competition and to maintain an artificial scarcity that kept prices high. For United Fruit, Arbenz's reform was an existential threat. For the U.S. government, it was framed as a communist plot. This narrative was made all the more compelling by the powerful conflicts of interest within the American administration. The most influential figures shaping U.S. foreign policy, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles, had deep and long-standing personal and professional ties to the United Fruit Company through their former law firm. Other powerful figures, like the Lodge family, also held significant investments in the company. Their personal financial interests were inexorably linked with the fate of United Fruit, making it nearly impossible to distinguish between the protection of American national security and the protection of their private portfolios. In 1953, the decision was made to remove Arbenz. Under the command of Allen Dulles, the CIA launched Operation PBSU Success, a covert plan to overthrow the democratically elected government. The agency recruited and trained a mercenary army of at least 1,725 foreign partisans at secret bases in neighboring Honduras. A key component of the operation was psychological warfare. According to rumors, the CIA intentionally allowed information about the impending invasion to leak into Guatemala,
a calculated strategy designed to create an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. As one CIA veteran, Chet Sheldon, later reflected on the role of propaganda in the operation, "We fanned a little red smoke, a little CIA, a little paranoia, and this made genuine communist threats almost indistinguishable from fictional ones." The invasion began on June 18, 1954. The coup, led by the CIA-backed Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, advanced into Guatemala. While the rebel force itself was not formidable, it was decisively supported by CIA-piloted aircraft that bombed key targets in the capital. Critically, Arbenz attempted to organize a resistance, but found that his own military, intimidated by the United States and infiltrated by CIA assets, refused to support him. Isolated and powerless, he was left with no choice but to concede. The final scene, tragic, unfolded on June 27, 1954. In the presidential palace in Guatemala City, a defeated Arbenz sat before a microphone to deliver his farewell address to the nation. With his hands trembling, he tried to tell the Guatemalan people about his reforms, about the fight for justice, and about the quest to return the land to the peasants. But his words were never heard. His voice was drowned out by the piercing shriek of electromagnetic noise as the CIA jammed the radio broadcast. Miles away, in the corporate and military offices that had engineered his downfall, the news of his resignation was met with elation. By evening, the troops of Castillo Armas were marching through the streets. For the farm workers who had, for a few brief months, owned their own plots of land, the dream was over as they watched their property being seized and returned to United Fruit. The consequences were catastrophic. Castillo Armas immediately established a brutal military dictatorship, reversed the land reform, and began a reign of terror. This active intervention plunged Guatemala into a devastating 42-year civil war that between 1960 and 2002 would claim the lives of up to 200,000 people. On the borderlands, dispossessed peasants fled into the jungles, forming the first cells of a guerrilla war that would last for generations.
No single individual embodies the contradictions and the ultimate moral reckoning of the Banana Wars more than Major General Smedley Butler. His life story is a profound journey from being one of the most decorated and effective instruments of American interventionism to becoming its most eloquent and ferocious critic. Butler was a warrior, a celebrated hero who participated in nearly every major American military engagement of his time. Yet his transformation from a loyal Marine officer into a passionate anti-war activist illustrates the deep internal conflict of the era, providing a powerful voice of conscience from the very heart of the military machine he once commanded. Smedley Darlington Butler, 1881 to 1940, built a career that was, by any measure, extraordinary. His service record reads like a history of American military expansion at the turn of the 20th century. He fought in the Philippine-American War, the Boxer Rebellion in China, the Mexican Revolution, and World War I, in addition to his extensive involvement in the numerous interventions across Latin America. His bravery was legendary, a fact cemented by his receiving the Medal of Honor not once, but twice, first for his actions in Taijin, China in 1900, and again for his heroism in Haiti in 1915. This distinction is so rare that only one other U.S. Marine in history shares it. His role in Central America and the Caribbean was central to the execution of the Banana Wars. In 1903, he commanded Marines in Honduras. From 1909 to 1912, he served in Nicaragua, where he led the lopsided Battle of Masaya. In 1914, he earned a medal for his part in the occupation of Veracruz, Mexico, and in 1915, he was a key figure in the brutal subjugation of Haiti. But beneath the surface of this model officer, a deep disillusionment was taking root. During his time in Nicaragua, Butler wrote desperate, soul-searching letters to his parents, expressing a profound depression and a growing doubt about the righteousness of his mission. If I had stayed in civil life, I might have gone to France, at least as a lieutenant, but now I have to sit here under a foreign flag while my own country is at war. The psychological toll was immense. In 1908, he was diagnosed with a nervous breakdown and granted 9 months of medical leave, during which he tried to escape his life by working in a West Virginia coal mine before ultimately returning to the Corps. After 34 years of distinguished service, Butler retired in 1931 with the rank of Major General, one of the highest-ranking officers in the history of the Marine Corps. It was in retirement that his transformation became complete. Shedding the persona of the loyal soldier, he became an outspoken activist. In 1935, he published a short, explosive book titled War is a Racket, in which he argued with fierce clarity that wars were nothing more than commercial enterprises designed to enrich corporations and financiers at the expense of the lives of ordinary soldiers. His central thesis was captured in the book's famous opening lines: "War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope." Butler turned the full force of his moral authority against the very system he had served. In speeches and writings, he laid bare the economic motives behind the interventions he had led. "I was a tool in the hands of businessmen, industrialists, financiers. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national city bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street." His new creed was unequivocal. If we have a war for the defense of our homes and our Bill of Rights, let's go. Any other reason for killing young men is just a racket. I'm not going to go to war again to protect some lousy investment of the bankers. His retirement was not without its own drama. Rumors persisted that even during his service, Butler had sometimes concealed official reports detailing the most barbaric acts committed by his Marines, perhaps because the reality was too shocking for even a hardened commander to formally acknowledge. More dramatically, in 1933, Butler claimed that a group of wealthy businessmen had approached him to lead a fascist military coup to overthrow President Franklin Roosevelt. Butler refused and publicly exposed the alleged business plot. An anecdote, perhaps apocryphal, but perfectly capturing his later sentiment, tells of a time when a young Marine asked the retired general what he regretted most about his career. Butler is said to have replied, "I regret that I didn't kill the man who ordered me to go and kill for the first time. Maybe I would have saved 1,000,000 lives." The image of his final years is that of an old soldier seeking redemption. In Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in 1938, the now gray-haired general stands before an auditorium of university students. His uniform hangs on a nearby chair. He no longer wears it. He speaks not of glory, but of bananas and blood, of how Marines were sent to kill peasants so that rich men could become richer. The students listen in stunned silence, a young journalist in the corner capturing every word of a speech that would be reprinted millions of times, cementing Smedley Butler's legacy as the conscience of the Banana Wars.
The historical significance of the Banana Wars extends far beyond the geographical and chronological confines of Central America and the Caribbean between 1898 and 1934. The events of this era were not an isolated anomaly, but rather a foundational chapter in the development of American foreign policy. This section examines how the strategies of intervention honed during this period, a potent combination of military force, political pressure, economic control, and ideological justification, were replicated in other regions and evolved over time.
The Banana Wars established a durable and adaptable template for American intervention that would be deployed for the next century, proving that while the theaters of conflict and the stated reasons might change, the underlying mechanics of power projection remained remarkably consistent. The blueprint for the Banana Wars was, in fact, being field-tested concurrently in another part of the world, the Philippines. The Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902, which began just a year after the Spanish-American War, saw the United States employ the very same methods that would become standard practice in Latin America. The intervention was publicly framed as a benevolent, civilizing mission to uplift a population supposedly incapable of self-government. In reality, it was a brutal military occupation designed to crush a local independence movement and establish an American-friendly government that would secure U.S. strategic and economic interests in the Pacific. The suppression of local resistance, the installation of a compliant political structure, and the justification of colonial rule under the guise of paternalistic guidance mirrored the playbook that was being written in Cuba, Panama, and Honduras. As the 20th century progressed, the fundamental strategy of intervention persisted, but its instruments evolved, particularly with the onset of the Cold War. In the 1950s, the United States began to favor the use of the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, for covert operations, a method that offered a less visible and more politically palatable alternative to dispatching the Marines. The 1954 coup in Guatemala, which saw a democratically elected government overthrown to protect the interests of the United Fruit Company, became the archetypal model for this new form of intervention. It was a stunning success from the perspective of U.S. policymakers, demonstrating that a foreign government could be toppled with a relatively small investment in mercenaries, psychological warfare, and air support, all while maintaining plausible deniability. This successful template was not an isolated case. It was a direct descendant of the Banana Wars logic applied with a new set of tools. The Guatemala operation itself followed a similar covert action in Iran 1953 and would later inform the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba 1961 and numerous other clandestine operations around the globe. Throughout this evolution, persistent rumors and analyses from within the U.S. foreign policy establishment suggested that the American state had never truly abandoned its core strategy. The use of economic pressure and the threat of military force to protect corporate interests remained a constant, even if the methods became more sophisticated and less overt. The era of gunboat diplomacy simply gave way to an era of backroom deals, covert actions, and economic warfare, but the ultimate goal remained the same. This continuity was perfectly summarized by one historian's assessment of the period. The Banana Wars established the pattern for American intervention for a century to come. Corporate interests determine foreign policy, the Marine Corps or the CIA provide the tools, and ideology, first civilization, then anti-communism, serves as the justification. This observation captures the enduring legacy of the era. It created a repeatable formula where the profit motives of private enterprise became fused with the strategic objectives of the state, all wrapped in a righteous ideological banner that could be tailored to fit the political climate of the day. The soldiers and supplies may have changed, but the fundamental mission, to ensure the world remains safe for American business, remained the central unspoken tenet of U.S. foreign policy.
The withdrawal of the last U.S. Marines from the region did not mark the end of the Banana Wars' influence. It merely signaled a transition. The legacy of this era of intervention is not a relic of the past, but a living, breathing force that has profoundly shaped the political, economic, and social fabric of Central America and the Caribbean for more than a century. The policies enacted and the systems installed during this period created deep structural problems that have proven to be tragically enduring. The external imposition of political and economic models designed to serve foreign interests directly led to the rise of brutal military dictatorships, forged economies of crippling dependency, and institutionalized a stark social stratification that continues to define these societies today. The most visible and violent legacy has been the region's chronic political instability, which frequently erupted into prolonged and bloody civil wars. The governments propped up or installed by the United States were often authoritarian and unrepresentative, ruling through force and serving the interests of a small elite and their foreign corporate partners. This created a fertile ground for dissent and armed rebellion. The consequences were catastrophic. In Guatemala, the 1954 CIA-backed coup that overthrew a democratically elected government plunged the nation into a horrific 42-year civil war, a conflict that raged from 1960 to 1996 and resulted in immense suffering. Similarly, in Nicaragua, the decades of American occupation and support for the Somoza dynasty culminated in the Sandinista Wars of 1979 to 1990, a conflict that further devastated the nation. In Haiti, the long U.S. occupation was followed by decades of political chaos and a cycle of dictatorships, leading to a state of near-constant instability from 1986 to 2004 and beyond. Economically, the Banana Wars locked the region into a structure of profound dependency. Even long after the direct occupations ended, the national economies remained tethered to the export of a single cash crop, be it bananas or coffee. This monocultural economic model, intentionally designed by the fruit companies, made these nations exceptionally vulnerable to fluctuations in global market prices and left them with little to no industrial base. They were economies built not for national development, but for the efficient extraction of resources for foreign markets. This legacy of dependency has been incredibly difficult to overcome, stymieing efforts to diversify and build self-sufficient, resilient economies. Socially, the interventions created a vast and deeply entrenched chasm between a small, wealthy minority and an impoverished majority. By consistently supporting authoritarian regimes and the landowning elite who were aligned with American corporate interests, the United States helped to create and solidify a rigid social hierarchy. This created an enormous gap between the rich, who often benefited directly from their connections to the U.S., and the poor, who were left landless and without political power. This systemic inequality became a defining feature of life in the banana republics, fueling social unrest and resentment that has simmered for generations. This grim inheritance is powerfully summarized in the findings of academic research on the period. The legacy of the Banana Wars has not disappeared. It has been firmly integrated into the structure of Latin American societies, where foreign investment still determines politics, and the military still serves as the guarantor of the system. This cycle of history is palpable even today. Imagine a scene in Honduras in the year 2024. A young Honduran peasant stands on a vast plantation, harvesting bananas for a modern multinational corporation, a direct successor to the companies of old. In his pocket is the day's wage, just enough money to feed his family for a week. He works in the shadow of a history he knows intimately. His own grandfather was killed during one of the workers' uprisings back in the 1920s. In the distance, the ancient ruins of Copan stand on a mountain, a silent reminder of a time before foreign intervention, a testament to an independent indigenous civilization. The young man looks up at the sky, his mind filled with a single, heavy question. Will his life and the lives of his children ever truly change, or is history doomed to simply repeat itself with new faces and new corporate logos presiding over the same old system?
The period of the Banana Wars, spanning from 1898 to 1934, stands as one of history's first and clearest examples of warfare conducted explicitly for corporate interests. It was an era in which the United States seamlessly blended its military might, political influence, and economic pressure to achieve a single overarching goal: the creation of banana republics. These were not true republics in any meaningful sense, but rather client states, wholly subordinate to the will of foreign corporations. This epoch of intervention did not merely influence the region's history, it fundamentally defined the political and economic trajectory of Central America and the Caribbean for more than a century, leaving a legacy of dependency and conflict that endures to this day. From this complex and often brutal history, several key lessons emerge. First, it demonstrates that military intervention is frequently cloaked in noble justifications, such as the defense of democracy, or later the prevention of communism, while its true purpose is the protection of economic interests. Second, the Banana Wars serve as a stark reminder that corporate power, when backed by the state's armed forces, can be every bit as destructive and coercive as the power of a state itself. Finally, the history of this period teaches us that popular resistance, even when it is violently suppressed, leaves deep and painful wounds on a society that can take generations to overcome. The historical significance of the Banana Wars is immense, precisely because the patterns of behavior established during this time did not end in 1934. Instead, this era served as a crucial prototype for subsequent American interventions throughout the Cold War and into the modern age. The methods of control developed and refined in the jumbles and capitals of Central America became a standard part of the American geopolitical toolkit. While the tactics continue to evolve, becoming increasingly covert and indirect through the use of international organizations and sophisticated financial instruments, the core strategy of using power to secure economic advantage remains a powerful force in contemporary geopolitics.